Welcome, friends, to At Home with Theosophy. This is the fourth class in which we are looking at Annie Besant's book. And today we are going to go through the next paragraph, that is Spiritual Alchemy.
The next chapter, which is Spiritual Alchemy. Yes. So in the first three chapters, Annie Besant talks about purification, building of character, and thought control. And she says that this is laying the foundation, that the aspirant in the outer court is laying the foundation. And then she talks about this spiritual alchemy, which we will see she defines as a change, as a transformation.
Mm-hmm. So let us start.
Let us now turn to the consideration of another part of our candidate's great task. I have described this as spiritual alchemy, and I had in mind a process of change, a process of transmutation. This process goes on, to some extent, I should imagine, in the mind and in the life of every thoughtful and religious person. But with our candidate, it becomes, as I have so often repeated, a self-conscious and a deliberate process.
So this is, as she says, that she repeats several times. I think this is one of the aspects that marks the difference between a more natural growth, which at the same time tends to be slower, or a growth in which there is a specific intention behind, based on a certain knowledge, and the fact that there is a specific intention makes that growth faster in general, because when there is a specific intention, there are also challenges that we call for with that intention. It's just like saying, I don't want to just play basketball with my friends, I want to play basketball professionally. So that intention calls the challenges in the sense of going to a place where we are going to be trained.
So in that same example of basketball, it would be as though I go to the park every day and people show up and we play with whoever's there. When it's time for me to up my game, then I seek out a place where I can train harder, train more, and have specific times and direction that I want to go in.
Mm-hmm. And the first part is, for the most part, just fun, the playing casually. The second part implies far more discipline and sacrificing other things, and the certain limitations that are not there when we just do it, casually. But when we talk about the spiritual path, or more specifically what in Theosophy is called the occult path, the reason why we take this more seriously, as Annie Besant keeps repeating, is because of service, because of the nature of suffering that is so prevalent in the world. And if we can learn how to go beyond suffering, then we can help others to do so.
Yes, and in this chapter, as we're going to see, she really makes a distinction between, or starts with the conflict between the higher and the lower, and makes the distinction between what the lower sees and what the higher sees. And in that, it's really a beautiful distinction that she makes, which goes from the lower seeing suffering to the higher seeing the joy in the same action. Now, this process of spiritual alchemy, spoken of, may be regarded, I think, in the most general sense of the term, as a transmutation of forces. The life, energy, vigor, power of will, and so on, that each of us has are transmuted from lower ends to higher, from gross energies to energies that are refined and spiritualized. And she gives a couple examples of this as we go on, and one that we can't get to, but she'll tell us we can take all aspects of our virtues or of our forces that we have, that we work with in the lower sense, that can be transmuted and worked for the good of humanity.
Mm-hmm. So basically, it's not the acquisition of something we don't have. It's rather at least at this point in the training, when a person is getting to the outer court or within the outer court, the main work there is to transform what we already have and to purify it, to transmute it, as she says, so that the higher aspect of all the forces that we are already using can be expressed through us.
Because those power of will, that vigor, that life, that energy can take us from the path around the mountain, and that raw power can take us up the hill, up the mountain, into the outer court. So now once we get into the outer court, we need to refine and make more graceful these aspects. Souls are bound to earth life, to the wheel of births and of deaths, by desires. They are held there by ignorance. They are fettered by their longings after material enjoyments, after separated and isolated joys, as it were. Continually engaged in actions, these actions bind the soul. Whether they be good or bad, helpful or mischievous, nonetheless, that action in the ordinary man springs from desire, and this desire is the binding and the fettering force. So here she makes a really nice distinction, because we think as long as what we're doing is for good, that it will bring good results. But it's in the desiring or the longing or the grasping, as she calls it, of those good results that binds us to this wheel of birth and death.
Mm-hmm. So the idea is that any kind of desire, whether for selfish or for more unselfish purposes, when there is a desire that is centered on me, I want to enjoy helping people, or I want to enjoy, being a good force in humanity. Even those good desires still bind us to the wheel of reincarnation. The idea is that desire is basically a binding force. So as long as we desire something, because that something that we desire is born within the physical plane and our relationships here, that produces a cause that has to be exhausted again on the physical plane. So as long as the soul is still generating these causes, the soul will be brought back to earth to enjoy the results, whether enjoy will be of pleasant or unpleasant results. And that is the first point that she makes here.
Actions must continue to be accomplished as long as man remains in the world. As a man grows nobler and wiser and stronger, his action becomes an ever more and more important factor in the world's progress. And supposing the greatest should abstain from action, then the progress of the race must necessarily be delayed. Its evolution must inevitably be retarded. How then shall it be possible that action shall be accomplished and yet the soul be free? How is it possible that action shall be rendered and yet the soul shall not thereby be bound and fettered? So I think sometimes we think that, or I know I do, think that if I continue to work and continue to do this and continue to sacrifice, that sacrifice will drop away and then something else will come in its place. But as Annie Besant will tell us here, it's the more you sacrifice and the better you become at sacrifice, the more you're needed in the world to help humanity, and the more you sacrifice. And then she'll explain between that higher and lower perception where that sacrifice turns from suffering to joy.
Mm-hmm. So another important point she's making here, if we are saying that action, this action, when we want to do something, that binds the soul. Even good actions bind the soul. And the question is, so what should good people who are seeking to break free from the limitations of the embodied life, should good people then abstain from doing actions? which means that the people who are working in the world will be the selfish people, those who are concerned about themselves. So how would humanity progress if those who have desires, but they have good desires, refrain from action? Because this is how generally this teaching was interpreted even in India. The idea that since desire to do something binds, then wise people should retire from the world, go to the forest, go to the desert, don't engage in anything, don't do anything, don't desire anything so that you can break free. So Besant, and even this is said in the Bhagavad Gita, but Besant will point out here that this is a mistake because the problem is not with the action itself, as we are going to see.
And this is an important aspect of the Theosophical teachings, is to stay in the world and stay with humanity with all its problems or with all its hardships, and be that force, be that tiny little light spark amongst the darkness.
So it says they desire to be free of desire. And yes, that is very, very true.
But it's kind of an unnatural free of desire, an unnatural. So, I can be free of candy.
Unnatural.
Right, unnatural, because I can be free of candy if nobody ever offers me candy. But the real task would be to put me in a candy shop and see where my desires go. Here again, we shall find a case of spiritual alchemy, whereby the greatest may be the most active in service, and yet his service shall touch him not as a liberated soul. This alludes to the fundamental law of sacrifice, which lies at the root of all in the manifested universe.
So here she's going to open the subject, which is action offered as a sacrifice is not binding, and we will see why.
Law of sacrifice, lower aspect. Let us take it first in its lower aspect, which nevertheless has for us many lessons. Let us take it as we find it expressed in manifested nature, working in the physical, the astral, the mental worlds, and so on. It may present itself to us as a continual turning of the wheel of life, in which each living being takes and gives, in which he cannot avoid the taking, in which he ought not to refuse the giving. All things take conscious or unconscious part in this process, and the more highly they are developed, the more conscious will be their cooperation. So here she's mentioning that there's an unconscious aspect to our work, to any kind of action, I should say, an unconscious aspect to any kind of action. It's when we make these actions conscious that we really do work for humanity.
So Annie Besant will examine two aspects of this law of sacrifice: how it manifests through the lower nature, as Michele was saying, and how it manifests through the higher nature. So when it manifests through the lower nature, the first thing that we see is that sacrifice is needed everywhere. One animal has to give up his or her or its life so that other animals can live. We have to take lives so that we can live. There is a question of giving and taking, which is inescapable from the physical world. We take something and we deprive somebody else from that, because resources are limited on the physical world. So a person that we are all engaged in this law of sacrifice, and we may complain, but we cannot escape it. Now, as Annie Besant says there, most of us are engaged in this in an unconscious way, but as we grow, we realize that this is part of how the world works. And in the same way that I get things from the sacrifice of other people, then I can also offer things so that other people can enjoy something.
In the Lord's Song, the Bhagavad Gita, says the great teacher, "The world is bound by all action, by with sacrifice for object. With such object, free from attachment, perform thou action. In this wheel of life, all action should be of the nature of sacrifice. That is, action should be done as duty, because it is right and with no other object. It should be done in order that man may be in harmony with law. It should be done because that is his answer to the law, his part of the common task. And when I read this part in the book, the part that action should be done as duty really resonated or really helped to make the distinction between action for the lower and action for the higher.
Yes, if we see why do we do things, I think a large percentage of the actions of most people, let's say we are generalizing, are based on whether I'm going to get something from it or not, whether I enjoy doing that or not, whether I have to do it because the law forces me and I don't want to get the punishment. So most of the actions are centered on me, on what I want or on what I can get or escape from. So that would be action that is generating an effect that will bring me back to enjoy the results of that cause. Now, what Annie Besant says here, that comes from the teaching in the Gita, is that if we are able to do things just because those things are needed to be done, then that action has a completely different quality. And she will go more in detail into this. That is the action of true sacrifice, where things are done because they need to be done.
And this is an interesting practice. I noticed I spent the last weekend with my 3 kids, so they're ages 20 to 25. And as I was studying this, I really kind of started noticing where their actions come from. And then I started noticing my reaction to where their actions come from. So it was a really good practice for me just to kind of take a step back and say, okay, why am I doing this? Or, I like this child because he's doing what I want him to do. And I'm not liking this child at this moment because he's doing just the opposite of what I say. So all that really helped bring these teachings a little closer to home. Under this teaching, sacrifice was the bond of union, the golden thread that linked together all beings in this manifested universe. So it was said that Brahman permeated every sacrifice, and all action that was done could thus be done as duty in the world, not with desire for individual fruit, not with desire for personal gain, not with wish to obtain something for the personal self.
So this is what we were talking about, and she's referring to the teachings in Hinduism. They many times talk about the creation of the world or the manifestation of the world as a sacrifice of Brahman, of the deity. Normally in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we don't have that concept that creating the world was a sacrifice for God. But in Hinduism, the idea is that Brahman itself is embodied and from a certain point of view imprisoned in matter because the cosmos is Brahma's body, and that this was a sacrifice for the divine that was in a completely free and unitive state, now is engaged in all this separation and limitation. So from the very beginning, in this view, the universe is the result of an act of sacrifice.
And an act of sacrifice out of love.
Yes, that's what we are going to come to, that Annie Besant explains. Normally, we relate sacrifice to suffering or, something.
Right.
Like
so, this is where she says, if we realize that the ultimate sacrifice came from above in order for the emanation of our beings, but the way we look at it is from the lower self where, I have to do this. I have to complete this task and somewhere we're trying to get it to meet in the middle.
Yeah, we will discuss all that in detail.
Here is the very essence of the alchemy which changing action into sacrifice burns up the bonds of desire, and liberates the wise. Thus burned in the fire of wisdom, action loses all its binding force upon the soul. The soul becomes a fellow worker with the divine in nature, and every action that is cast upon the altar of duty becomes a force which turns the wheel of life but never binds the soul.
Even the word duty is seen in a negative light in general, because, again, just as with sacrifice, we feel that duty is something that we do only because we must, but if we could choose, we would not do it. There are some examples always, like we have mentioned this before, but a mother that takes care of the child, that is a sacrifice. The mother does it out of duty, in the sense that I'm the mother, I have to do this. But along with that can be the feeling of love. That duty is produced not because somebody from outside, not because the government is looking whether I take good care of my child or not, or otherwise I'll lose him. This duty comes from an inner decision, motivated by love. So when we talk about duty, again, if that duty comes from the higher nature, it's an inner compulsion that is not experienced as I am being forced to do this.
None of these explanations make sense to the ego.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, and Annie Besant will talk about that.
The work of our aspirant in the outer court is gradually to train himself to perform all action in this sacrificial way, doing it because it ought to be done, and for no other reason. He is in conscious harmony with the divine will in the manifested universe, and so becomes a force for evolution, an energy for progress, and the whole race that benefits by the action, which otherwise would only have brought a personal fruit, which in its turn would have bound the soul and limited his potentialities for good. Thus then, we may regard this law of sacrifice as working when regarded in its lower aspect. So I think we talked about this in a previous class, how, and going back on what Pablo said, how it starts out as rules and laws that we have to, our behavior, our conduct is regulated. And then as we move or we mature as a society or a civilization, then those become more of a duty. And what we're doing now, what she's talking about, is taking that duty and moving it in, or it naturally moves into more of a compulsion. But from that compulsion, it moves out of like a have to into I want to, because I see where this is going.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and when we say compulsion, we are not talking about this in psychological terms, like some unconscious, unresolved issue that forces us to do this. Compulsion in the sense of an inner force that leads us to do this. And you see what is interesting here is that Besant says, when we do something, even when we do something good, that if we do it because we want the result of that in some way, the force produced by the action, karmically speaking, will be spent in bringing me the results, because that is the intention with which that force was produced. So there is like a curve that will bring the result to me. But in that curve, nobody else can benefit from that force that was set free, because it wasn't really free. It had strings attached. Mm-hmm. Now, when we do something with no personal intention behind, more than just benefiting others, or I do this because it's the right thing to do, that force is free to benefit humanity, and doesn't necessarily come back to the person individually, because it was spent for the welfare of humanity. Of course, since we are one with humanity, that force is also helping the spiritual nature in us, but not necessarily the personality. So from the point of view of the personality, it is a sacrifice, it is a loss. But from a deeper point of view, all this is making the real in us stronger and clearer.
Love, sacrifice, higher aspect. Let us come on now to the higher, to the sublimer view. Let us try to realize what sacrifice really means. Regarded in its innermost essence, sacrifice is a giving or a pouring forth. It is motivated by the desire to give. Its essence is in the longing to pour forth something which is possessed, and which, being precious to the possessor, he desires to pour out for the helping and joy of others. Therefore, it is, in its essence, joyous and not grievous. Now, going back, and I think we took this one out. The one that says the lower aspect is grasping, it's separating, it's isolating, it's removing itself. I'm doing this because I want that. And in this higher aspect, we can see the difference. We can see how it's going forth, and it keeps going forth and doesn't necessarily come back, like Pablo said, to the personality. But when it goes out there, it keeps going out there. And because we're one with everything, our soul benefits from it.
This is like when we are in love, we enjoy giving to the other person, for example. There is this joy, this pleasure in just giving. And that is true sacrifice. Of course, we wouldn't call it sacrifice because we normally look at this word from the lower nature and we associate sacrifice with some kind of suffering, some kind of loss. But the word sacrifice, it comes from the Latin and it means sacred office or sacred action. So the true meaning of the word sacrifice is an action that is sacred. And as Annie Besant is going to explain, when for the higher nature, the act of sacrifice is a joyous act. I am giving up my time to help this person that I love. If I'm focused on the love that I feel, I do it joyously. I feel the love and the joy of doing it. But if that love is not so strong, if I'm not positioned there and I'm positioned on my personality, I may do it because, well, this person is my girlfriend, my husband, and I have to do it, but I feel the loss of, I could be doing something else. So you see that the same act can be experienced as a loss or as a joy, depending on where we are standing. And this is what Annie Besant is developing here.
Susan says, when we are looking for ways to be of service, the happiness actually precedes the deed. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then Ed adds, we see it's our higher nature to pour forth. Mm-hmm. And I have to be honest here. Sorry. A lot of this is a very nice place to be for that happiness to precede the deed. That doesn't happen a lot, I would say, for me, in the sense of as a mom, some of my actions, I continue to do the right thing, but it's that discernment I need to find where how much I can put forth and how much is too much sacrifice, where I'm sacrificing myself. So finding that balance to find that joy and harmony in deeds will be a nice thing right there.
Well, because everything is very complex. I mean, we are talking about principles, and when we talk about the principles, we simplify the situations. But because the higher has to express through the lower, if the higher is pushing too much the lower may break down because the lower is limited. So Annie Besant used to say that action which I cannot perform is not my duty, in the sense that part of the spiritual growth has to do with the development of wisdom. So how to keep the balance and give as much as it is possible without destroying the instrument for giving. So, of course, in some occasions, there may be the need to sacrifice the lower instrument because the cost is greater than any individual instrument. But when the higher begins to make its presence stronger, there may be that compulsion to take on more than we can handle. And we will see that. We will talk about that when we see how actually the higher and the lower relate to each other.
And it's that discernment that they talk about all over the place, but in at the feet of the master. It's and when I was looking at that, and I was really trying to see where I should put my energies and where I should say no. It's really a tricky dance to do when people are counting on you, or you want to be helpful and you want to be forthcoming, but you just can't.
Yeah, because to probably most of you who have a nature that tends to help, normally in the world, most people don't tend to help. So those who do, people keep giving them tasks or asking from them and giving them those things that they know nobody else wants to do. And, it's part of the price to be paid. And even if it is uncomfortable, if it can produce minor problems, minor from the point of view of the higher, even the personality is stressed out. But from a higher perspective, all this is part of the process of growth. But yet we have to develop discernment, as Michele says.
The supreme act of sacrifice was the self-limitation of the one existence. This view of sacrifice has been held to imply what seems to me a contradiction in terms, the agony of the Logos. But what is Logos? Brahman in manifestation, and the nature of Brahman is bliss. This is a nice long paragraph where she really breaks it down. But the essence of it is that the nature of Brahman is bliss, and when Brahman manifests into from the one existent into the limited self, that this is the sacrifice that we were talking about earlier.
If you see in all religions, there is some emphasis on the sacrifice of the divine, and it's tied to the concept of suffering. So in Christianity, Jesus was crucified. This was his sacrifice for humanity. And the process of being crucified is very cruel, and there is a strong emphasis on how he suffered for us. And the same happens in Hinduism many times with this idea of Brahman sacrificing itself for the manifestation of the world. Agony is a word sometimes used in connection to this, as Annie Besant says there. In, Egyptian mythology also, one of the gods was chopped in pieces and killed in that way and spread around the world. So there is this emphasis on the sacrifice of the divine and the deep suffering that implies. Now, Annie Besant is going to question this, because she is going to show if the divine, the very nature of the divine is bliss, how can that sacrifice imply suffering? And why do we place emphasis on suffering?
If you take the Raja Yoga, you will find that as the soul retires from the lower world, as it shakes off the lower sheath, as it goes upwards and upwards, ever approaching the Brahman, which is itself, and becoming ever more and more its own essential nature, you will find that at the very end there is a sheath, the highest, so subtle that it scarcely differentiates it from the one and only, and that sheath has a name, the sheath of bliss. This is to remind everyone who is struggling in the world in the coils of ignorance that this progress in yoga is to be carried on from stage to stage until the soul is enveloped in nothing but bliss.
So she's using the word sheath from the tradition of Vedanta in Hinduism. And as she says, the idea is that as the soul frees itself from the limitations of matter, the soul gets closer and closer to true bliss, which means that the higher is always in a state of bliss. Suffering is in the imprisonment in the lower with ignorance, because when there is wisdom, that imprisonment is not painful any longer, and that the essence of the soul is bliss. So from here, she will elaborate on this question of sacrifice as bliss.
So you realize that there is not possible an act of sacrifice in that lofty region which can be aught but an act of joy, an act of the giving forth of bliss. The very object of the self-limitation of the one was to pour forth the bliss which was its own essential nature, so that when the cycle of existence should be completed, there should be many individuals, radiant and joyous, to share with it that perfect bliss, a bliss which should ever grow as they approach to itself. There is misery only in the supposed distance from it, because of the ignorance in which the soul is wrapped. And I'm going to jump because I'm not sure if the quote's in here. But when I read this, I got the idea of, so our personality has this innate nature to grasp and hold on to, and to separate and build walls and this in itself is what causes the misery of it. So this being gets put here on earth, which is like somebody who has the need for candy gets put into a candy shop. So there's this constant battle between, this is what I'm surrounded with, this is what I know I need to get to, but it's hard. And so eventually, though, our taste buds change as we go from the heavier, denser physical to the more subtle nature of ours, and then we don't even have a taste for candy anymore.
Yes, and here again, that example of doing something out of love or being centered in the personality, I think it applies, because what Annie Besant says here is that the divine is always in this state of bliss, and our souls, not when they are incarnated, because the souls get blinded by matter, but our souls in their true nature, they are always in this state of bliss, of love. So any act of giving, any act of limiting themselves that comes from that place comes as an act of love, as a joyous, blissful act, as when we do something for the person we love. It is only when we are not in that state of consciousness any longer, and we get caught up in my little needs, that may seem as something painful.
But she does say in the chapter there is a saving grace that through this pain and through this alchemic process, which is a burning of, we burn off those heavier layers, those heavier sheets, and we get to feel some of that, get closer and touch some of that blissful, the sheath of bliss.
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is the fail-safe that evolution has. The fact that suffering exists only in the identification with the lower. So we are identified with the lower, and we may keep trying to satisfy the lower, but because suffering essentially exists on that level, suffering itself will make us little by little let go of the lower and realize that bliss that was always at our hands' reach, if we would only let go of the lower. So that is a safe,
fail-safe. Yeah, that's a good point, a good way to look at it. The dual nature of sacrifice. How then, it may fairly be asked, has this idea of pain been taken so continually in connection with sacrifice? Why have they been identified so much in thought that the very use of the word sacrifice conveys to the mind the necessary idea of unmingled agony? We must understand what I spoke of as the dual aspect of the law of sacrifice. For the higher, in giving there is joy, but inasmuch as the lower nature is one which grasps rather than gives, from this standpoint, sacrifice shows itself continually as a renouncing, which is pain. I think it's really good to remember your definition of sacrifice that you gave, that it's a sacred action. If I can get that in my mind, then that makes it a little easier. It takes a little away more of the conditioning that sacrifices pain.
Mm-hmm. And it's all a question of, as we grow spiritually, we start being more focused or positioned more and more closer to the higher. And therefore, those actions that for another person may seem a sacrifice, for this person is not a sacrifice. Like, for example, here in Crotona, there are retired people that come to Crotona to volunteer and keep working and helping, the center run and offering spiritual education to people. And maybe some other retired person would say, why do you do that? You worked all your life. Why aren't you enjoying just going on trips on a ship or this or that? But for the person that is living a little closer to the higher, this is not felt as a sacrifice. For another person that is not, it may be felt as sacrifice. So as we grow, the how we experience the giving has this transmutation gradually into a more joyous sense.
And it may be felt as a duty or done out of love, but it doesn't mean that the person is not going to get tired or get frustrated or, be a little, disheveled at times. So I think we think that because I'm doing my duty, I'm doing it out of love, I'm doing it, that it should be a yellow brick road.
Mm-hmm.
Coming out into this world for the gathering of experience where the soul is as yet not at all developed, where its influence over the lower is of the slightest possible kind. At first, all activities of the lower nature are directed towards grasping, taking, and holding for its own isolated and separated self. Here's the quote that I talked about.
So the natural tendency of, because the lower, and this is not because the lower is evil,
right?
It's just due to the very nature of our higher and lower nature. The lower, if the lower doesn't eat, the lower just dies. The higher doesn't have to eat to survive. The higher is eternal. So the lower has to accumulate food. The lower has to protect itself from the environment. The lower has to protect the psyche, otherwise the psyche can be broken. So the very nature of the lower, that is transitory, that is feeble, that is, limited, makes the lower, or imprints in the lower, this natural tendency to grasp. The very nature of the higher, that is eternal, always outpouring, that is free from needs, the natural tendency is to give. So when the two are connected, at the beginning, the higher nature cannot imprint its nature on the lower, and the most of the actions come from the lower. And as Annie Besant is going to show, little by little that shifts until the lower is just a vehicle of the higher.
We have to remember that our previous evolutionary scheme was that of the animal world. And so this is an instinct, this grasping, this taking, this holding, this our territorial is absolute instinct. So we're at a stage where we understand that it's instinct, and we're a little bit, at the point where we don't need to grasp everything. We don't need to hold on to everything. And we're realizing that there is another part of the world that we can live in, where we don't have to live with this animal nature, this animal instinct. So we're kind of still coming out of that. We're not, to the place where we naturally know, okay, everything is taken care of for us. All I need to do is give.
The advantage that animals have is that they don't have this ignorant mind. So they are connected to the wisdom of the universal mind. So they do whatever they need to preserve their separate physical bodies. But then when that life form acquires a mind and becomes a human being, we begin to transfer that need to preserve onto the psychological area. And then we accumulate, and then we plan for the future and become ambitious and everything that we know that is a problem in humanity.
Right. So there's that natural innate motion that brought in by an immature or a young mind, and that's kind of that hard area that it is to break away from. And it's it naturally takes time. It's something that we just have to kind of grit our teeth and go through it until we are old enough to realize, or mature enough to realize, that there is everything we need. The meaning and use of pain is its gradual teaching to man of the nature of law and of the transitory nature of the desires of the senses, of the gratifications of the animal nature. In this way, pain leads to knowledge, as also pleasure leads to knowledge. And experiencing these two sides of manifested nature, the soul gathers a little knowledge of the underlying reality of things.
So if this constant seeking to acquire something, whether it is material, emotional, whether it's an intellectual ambition or for power, if this constant seeking to acquire would be effective, the soul would never seek anywhere else. The soul would be stuck living in a world of illusion where the soul doesn't know its true nature, that is far more blissful than anything that can be accomplished on the physical plane. But because essentially we keep failing by in this attempt at being happy and peaceful by acquiring things, little by little the soul begins to realize the nature of the physical world and begins to learn through the pain, through the disappointment, that this is not the way. Of course, as Annie Besant says there, joyous experiences also teach us, and we are placing emphasis on the suffering because those are the ones that we resent in general.
The lower and the higher find themselves in conflict. The higher wills a certain achievement. Through the lower, it has to work. The lower understands not the aim of the higher, realizes not the object which the higher sees. Without that cooperation of the lower, the object of the higher cannot be accomplished. And so there is this struggle with the lower nature. To the lower nature, still wrapped in ignorance, this results as a feeling of restraint, a feeling of enforced giving up of what it desires to have. Here, to me, this means that I think a lot of times we think we've done something wrong because I can't give with joy, or I feel this sacrifice is a burden to me. But here, as she says, it's a natural process. It's like the step before, okay, I get it. It has to be this place of resentment, this place of, I don't want to do this.
Yes, when the higher nature begins to, and of course we talk about the higher nature and the lower nature as being two different ones. It is essentially the same consciousness, one acting free from illusion, the higher nature, or the same consciousness acting through the illusion of feeling I am this body, these emotions, this mind, and that is what we call the lower nature. For the purposes of presenting this, we talk, for practical purposes, it seems like they are two different things. But when we as consciousness are expressing ourselves through a personality, but we still retain, unconsciously perhaps, that knowledge that we are not this personality, that separation is not the way. Now, we may retain that knowledge, which is the product of experience, of evolutionary experience, and yet we still feel also the pull of the lower to have fun, to have an easy life, to enjoy. When the lower is ruling, there is no conflict because the person is just self-centered, and thus the conflict is with the environment trying to get what he or she wants, but there is no inner conflict. When the higher begins to impose, in a certain sense, its nature on the lower, that is where the friction is. And there is bound to be some level of conflict there, because the lower is still resisting, but I would say that when this conflict is there, that is what marks the victory of the higher. Now, to be completely accomplished is just a question of time. When the higher is strong enough to push the lower to do something, even though the lower doesn't want to do it, that means that the higher has more strength than the lower, even though the lower may come in the way. Now, as I said, it's just a question of time, so that the higher, little by little, reshapes the lower and aligns the lower to the higher. And the real threshold for me is this shift from the self-centered attitude to beginning to realize that there is duty in life. That is the threshold that is hard to cross. Once that is crossed and this conflict is evident, it's just a question of time and experience.
And this is a good example, or the easy example that I can see is in the teenager. You can see when the teenager is trying to break free into that adulthood, but they still want what they want. Why can't I just do what I want to do? Why do I have to do...
To be responsible.
To be responsible. Why do I have to do this? So you can see that battle or that conflict that goes on daily.
But you see that eventually the process is already started.
Right.
Eventually,
right. And
it
you
will
can
lead
see,
to adulthood.
Then that which to the lower nature is painful, to the soul is not unwelcome, as it brings with it experience. Gathering the experience, the soul transmutes it into knowledge, and knowledge into wisdom, the wisdom which is ever a source of pure and unadulterated joy. This growing wisdom means an increasing vision, an increasing serenity, and an increasing strength. And this is that point. We've turned the corner now from the constant conflict, and we have this experience, which is, growing into knowledge, and this knowledge into wisdom, and this wisdom into joy. That's when we've turned the corner.
Yes, although if you see the first paragraph, there is a long time where both things are at the same time happening. The soul, when the painful experience comes, the personality feels the pain. As she's saying, that which to the lower nature is painful, the personality still feels the pain, and at the same time, the soul recognizes the value of it. So for a long time, both things are together. One is not the denial of the other. It's not that unless we can go through this hardship joyously, we are not taking it spiritually. No, for a long time, both things are there. In spite of the suffering, the person is doing his or her best to do the right thing. And then, as Annie Besant says, all this begins to develop a growing wisdom, a growing ability to see more completely, and then the serenity, and then the strength. All that, as I say, is a question of time. Once the higher is the master there, even if the lower is still resisting, it's just a question of time and experience.
And I think, too, that our personality wouldn't be able to survive a constant denial of, or not seeing the wisdom and not seeing the knowledge, whereas this conflict or this back and forth nature is what allows us to continue and keep going.
Mm-hmm. So we go from no conflict, when the personality does whatever the personality wants.
Ignorance is bliss.
Ignorance is bliss. To this transitional state where conflict is acute, and then we transcend that and come at the other end of the transitional experience, comes serenity, wisdom, strength, where there is no conflict any longer again.
Slowly there comes into the lower nature, as the higher works upon it more effectually, an understanding that it is well that this thing should be done, that although there may be pain in the doing, the gain is well worth the suffering, and that this overcoming of difficulty by effort.
Mm-hmm. So this is little by little the higher begins to assert itself.
Thus, as the soul is developed, he then finds that through sacrifice he burns up limitations that held him down, and that he burns up weaknesses that held him back, and that the touch of the fire, which seemed at first painful, is really nothing more than the burning of the chains that held him. This is a quote.
Yes, and that is part of the transmutation. There is a period where even where we begin to accept the suffering. Not that we like the suffering, not that we like the difficulties, not that we like these things, but there is no resistance any longer because one can recognize that this is valuable, that there is something I have to do here, that if there is suffering, it's because there is something that I am not quite understanding, and therefore I am a slave of that thing that I don't understand, and not intellectually, but deeply. So after the raw conflict comes this growth in which suffering is still felt, but now it is kind of welcomed, and we are willing to work with it.
And that's the spiritual alchemy, the transmutation, the turning of the tide to where you understand. And when the soul is approaching the gateway of the temple, when this process is to a great extent understood, the soul will begin to see that all this is really a process of getting rid of limitations, and that the whole of the suffering is in these limitations, which prevent it from realizing its oneness with its brothers, as well as its oneness with the divine. And not only that, but as this limitation is felt to be illusory, as this limitation is seen as apparent and not real, and as having no part in the world where the true man is living, then he will begin deliberately to transmute these faculties of the lower nature, and by this alchemic process refine them.
Mm-hmm. So the more one understands that this suffering is illusory, not in the sense that it's not there, but in the sense that it doesn't really matter if that person treated me well or not. It's something very, small if you look at things from the point of view of the soul. Then you understand, why would people have to like me? Why am I expecting everybody to like me? It's just fair that some people like me and some people don't. And when you start seeing the illusion of all that, then the soul is able to begin to use its forces for a higher purpose. That is what Annie Besant is going to talk about. So here is where wisdom opens the door for this other transmutation, that is how we use the forces that we have.
And Deborah asks, so the lower self is then aware of all these changes and accepts all, and accepting of everything. I would say yes and no. That is I think, sorry, I don't remember all the slides, but there is a slide where she says how the adepts and the disciples get to this point where everything is accepted and everything is understood, or everything is understood, so everything is accepted. For me personally, I don't think I will get to a point in this lifetime that I will truly be blissfully accepting of everything. I will be very happy if it comes, but I feel that my personality is so strong and so struggling with this kind of sacrifice and it being of a higher nature that I don't know that it becomes a full process. It's like getting hit. This is the example that I always give. No matter how enlightened I am, if I get hit in the head with a rock, my head's going to react. My body, my physical body is going to react. It's a natural. But I'll be able to accept it and be able to get through it in a different way than I can now.
Well, there is a misunderstanding. Normally, we have to separate two things, and this always gets in the way. One is the acceptance, the other is the sensitivity to that. So not accepting something, not accepting that this person is hurting me would mean I'm going to hurt this person back, and I'm going to try to take revenge on the person, and I'm going to try to trick the person so that person suffers Even if the person stops hurting me, I want to pay the person back. That is not accepting. The accepting comes into the person is hurting me, even though I feel the hurt. I don't have that I don't engage, even though my desires wish to get back to the person. My mind may think about that. I just don't do it. So the soul is accepting the situation, even though the personality will feel the pain.
Still hurt by it.
Yes. So if we have unreal expectations, we will be frustrated. As long as we have an emotional body, there will be an emotional response. If we have a physical body, there will be a physical response to physical things. What happens is that as the soul grows, this pain is seen more and more, as I said, as irrelevant, illusory, and then the pain has less hold on our actions. So there is a certain freedom from pain, not because pain is not there, but because pain has lost the ability to drag me in directions that I don't want to go. Because when we are upset, we may do things that the next day we say, I should not have done that. And that means that my anger dragged me into doing something that I don't want. So the anger may be there, but it loses the ability to drag me into the wrong action. And that is what we can expect with growth, and not to feel anything. Eventually, when the distance between the soul and all this increases, the experience of pain also decreases. But that is something that is a byproduct. It's not something we should judge whether we are spiritual or not by that.
Let us take one case and see how that might be. Take the pleasure-seeking instinct, which always ends in suffering. How shall the soul deal with that? By gradually seeking to eliminate the element of separateness, by constantly trying to get rid of the desire to exclude, by burning up that lower wall so that it shall no longer divide itself from its other selves. When the soul finds that it has gained some spiritual power, knowledge, or truth, it will train itself to feel that the joy of possession lies really in the act of giving, not in the act of gaining. So here she really talks about this was something that I could hold on to, that pleasure-seeking instinct or the desire to exclude. We can see that, or if I watch myself closely, if I'm aware, if I watch how my thinking is, it naturally tends to want to be separate or exclude or divide, to categorize. So I can see how my mind does that. I can see how my emotions do that, and I can see where that takes my actions to do, my reactions will do that. So if I understand that is part of the pleasure-seeking instinct, then I can make that space that Pablo was talking about, and even though the thoughts are there, the emotions are there, and the wanting of the actions are there, I can step back and say, wait a minute, no, this is what it is, and this is not where I want to go with it.
Yes, the world is constantly pushing in the opposite direction. So this is an example Annie Besant is giving me how to transmute the energies of the lower into the higher. And she says basically the need for separation is the basic problem that has to be transmuted. But, if we have a good idea, we want to put a copyright on that idea. I share it only if everybody knows that is my idea. That is the separation where I want things for me, and I share it only as long as this idea is protected. Or this work that I do, this is my work. Then I can share it, but this is my work. Or my family, and this is my family. And if you spend time with my family, then I'm jealous because I don't have this sense of sharing. So with everything, in many times in very subtle ways, we can see how we want to put these walls instead of working in whatever I have it to share it. That is how we transmute this particular force. If we can little by little get into this sense of the reason to gain something is so that I can share it, and not that the reason I gain something is to build up myself, then we can start transmuting this basic instinct of, seeking pleasure for myself.
So this is the marking of the territory that is an animal instinct. I mark my territory. Here it is. Here's my wall. A good practice that as I was reading this throughout the week, that I thought, can I do anything without getting recognition? Can I do something for someone else, or donate, or contribute without being said, oh, here Michele did this, or here I did this? And I noticed that that's very hard for me not to be able to do that. I want, even with my kids, I want them to know what I did for them. Can I do it without that?
Mm-hmm. And this is something that is the essence of the lower nature. So we get rid of the grosser aspects of them. Competition and all this is the manifestation of this. But as we get rid of the grosser aspects of them, we always see subtler and subtler ways in which we are essentially doing this. So there is a process of purification that goes on.
So what Annie Besant talked about, purification and building of character and thought control, continues. It didn't just stop and now we're at this next stage, but continues as we go along through this. You might take quality after quality of the lower nature and trace it out as I have traced these two. And
because in the book, she also talks about love, right, sharing the love or being jealous and holding.
Right. And the love one actually was a little clear to me, that why are we loving? Why do we love this person? Or why do we like this person? Or why is this person my friend? And that's one way to take this and trace it out.
Yeah. And, it is fine if this person is my friend, if this person is my wife or my son. Do I want to enjoy the beauty of that person just for myself? Do I get jealous when somebody else also is enjoying that? Do I put the wall around? Or I am happy also sharing the happiness? So of course, we are talking about living in a society where there are rules and all that, but we are talking about psychologically. Can I share my love with others psychologically? Or do I have this sense of jealousy, or why do you spend so much time with my son, my mom, my
right,
wife?
Or why am I not friendly to this person? Is it because, they don't think like me, or they don't dress like me, or they're not like me? So why am I building that wall is another way to do it. So let me finish the quote here. You might take quality after quality of the lower nature and trace it out. And you will see that the whole of the process is essentially a getting rid of the separateness, a burning up of that by deliberate will and deliberate knowledge and understanding. And there is yet another way in which this transmutation may occur, that as this fire of wisdom and of love, which is the divine nature in man, comes forth into the lower nature more and more, burning up those limitations, there is also a liberation of spiritual energy, of spiritual power, and the very burning up of the lower sets free subtle forces of the higher, so that the result of the burning is the liberation of the spiritual life, the setting free of that which was bound and could not manifest itself, but which, when this outer film shall be burned up, is free for work in the world.
Mm-hmm. So this is part of what Blavatsky used to call the occult dynamics of forces. So we are like this whirlpool. There are cosmic forces that are trapped by our sense of I am an individual, and they are constantly working around us. And for all purposes, they are just imprisoned in this little whirlpool. When we begin to break that psychological wall, then these forces is like they expand, they are set free, and they become an evolutionary force for the environment around, for people around. This is why when somebody is close to a spiritual person, that person tends to reproduce spiritual feelings in himself or herself, because there is an outpouring of forces that are set free, which elevates. Yeah.
He will gradually be able to permeate the lower nature with his own conviction, as he gradually purifies it from ignorance and makes it realize the reality instead of the delusive appearance of things. And in proportion as the true man within us develops, in proportion as he is able to translate himself into the lower nature, just insofar will he realize that the essence of all his efforts is to bring to the helping of a sorrowful world this manifestation of joy and peace.
So this is the aspect of service, that the more we are in touch with the higher nature, the more we understand that this question of giving, that is where we started at. And remember always that when Besant and Ledbetter and Blavatsky, they talk about the true man in us, they are using the word man as from the Sanskrit root manu, the thinker in us, which is the soul. So of course today we have more sensitivity with the non-neutral gender words, but Besant is referring here to the soul.
As the soul is rising onto higher planes and realizing its identity with all and the oneness of all, we begin dimly to see the outline of a great truth, the prize of spiritual achievements, the possibilities of spiritual rest and of spiritual bliss may be surrendered by the soul as a joyful act, which is for it a necessity of its own nature, in order that it may become common property and spread through the race of men to help forward their evolution. Here, she is talking about how disciples give up the spiritual rest of Devachan in order to come back or reincarnate more quickly so that they can be more of a force of nature for humanity. And then eventually, as an adept, instead of reaching that blissful nirvana and becoming one with the all, they renounce that and come back. So these are the natural sacrifices, and kind of like the progression. The sacrifices that we're making now are just a smaller progression of that.
Like the example of retirement that I just gave. Some people retire and they not only working on a spiritual center, but they remain trying to help others in any way. So then after we retire from physical life and we can enjoy unalloyed bliss in Devachan, the soul decides, this is very nice, but there is work to be done. And same with nirvana.
Right, nirvana. So it's a process and a progression of sacrificing.
And this is what Besant refers to this again. She says many times, Blavatsky, for example, would present this idea of giving up nirvana in the context of something painful that the adepts do, a sacrifice, as something that they are giving up. And Besant says, yes, from the point of view of the lower nature, then this looks as something that they give up. And there is a reason why these teachings are presented in that way, because these teachings are talking to the lower nature, which is how the lower nature experienced this. So if the adepts sacrifice themselves to help me, then I should sacrifice myself also to help others. So the message is given in that way to resonate with the personality. But she's saying in the experience of the adept, because there is this enlightened consciousness, there is no pain or sorrow.
There's no thought. There's no and it's not like they get to nirvana or they get to that point and say, okay, should I go? Should I stay? It's kind of a natural path. And it's part of this, like we said, you give up retirement in your physical body. You give up, devachan in your soul. And then you give up nirvana.
Your spirit.
Yeah. One of the other things she talked about was another truth, the strength given as we bear or reap the karma we have sown. A soul becomes aided even while bearing the burden of its karma. And that was something like another perk of this process, that because of the fact that on this occult path, we usually are burning karma of many lives within one lifetime. This alchemic process, or the spiritual alchemy, gives us the strength to do that, to bear, to bear our karma, where otherwise it would, I guess you could say, where otherwise it would crush us.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there is. Well, Annie Besant will talk about that in the next chapter. But there is always a power helping all humanity. But those who take on themselves harder tasks, then the power helps them, more specifically, just because it's a natural reaction to taking on heavier burdens. And it's a question of, even if we don't know it, that power is always there helping out. And that power is not really different from us. This is another way of putting it. But the fact that a soul is taking on a higher, a heavier burden, let's say, means that the spiritual nature is more present there, and therefore is more able to help. So it's all part of the same.
And there's Madame Blavatsky talks about within these sacrifices and these renunciations that are being done along the way, it adds a force of nature to what is called the guardian wall. And this guardian wall is the place where we don't even know how much more suffering or how much more difficulties we would have if it wasn't for this guardian wall.